we not partnering with a God who brought water from a rock? Then certainly he can do a new thing in our lives, in our mindsets, in our hearts, in our motives, in our agendas. Certainly this is the God that can tease out from us extra patience and long-suffering and kindness, the fruits of the Spirit. We get confronted with this just, perpetual hamster wheel. Some people have a very dark name for it, the wheel of death, when you really are depending on this software or this program or this technology to work and it just doesn't. And sometimes, if you're like me, the problem is probably because you have 50 tabs open and maybe 100 different files saved on your desktop when they should be organized into folders. Sometimes it's that you keep ignoring those notices to update your software. Sometimes it's an old floppy hard drive that needs to become a solid state hard drive. So one of my beloved predecessors, a pastor of this church, Pastor Manuel Silva, I still remember him using computer problems as just this really great metaphor for understanding our spiritual selves. He likened, sin to being the virus that infects our operating system, that corrupts our internal programming, and how Jesus' salvation is like getting that upgrade. It's like getting that clean slate, the drive, wiped with a fresh new start, a brand new operating system. And so today I want to revisit that idea and how we need to sometimes reboot in order to resolve the dysfunction that keeps us stuck, that inhibits our growth, that inhibits God's dreams and desires for us to flourish as individuals, but also in community as a church. We're interconnected. For me, this is kind of personal. There's a very significant indicator that something in our churches, something in our faith community, something in our religion and our denominations, in the institution of faith has been broken. And that was revealed quite dramatically during the pandemic. After the initial spike of interest and people tuning in, and those churches who shifted to online ministry saw incredible spikes and new interests. Well, fast forward just a year later, and we saw culture shift again. We saw what you may have experienced or been part of, known as the Great Resignation in 2022. And following that was this concept of quiet quitting, just checking out. You need the paycheck, but you're no longer invested. You're no longer really contributing. And churches, sadly, were not immune. So if we put on the next slide that shows some statistics, Barna did a survey of pastors in the spring of 2022 and found that 42% of them were seriously considering quitting. When asked why, the majority said it was the immense stress of the job, definitely amplified during the pandemic when you were typically ministering in person and face-to-face, and now you're learning new skills and feeling out of touch. Another 43%, probably again tied to pandemic constraints, were feeling lonely and isolated in ministry. Some expressed that it was the divisions in their church, political, theological, moral disrespect or loss of credibility in some of their leaders and colleagues and church management. And a significant 1/3 said they just couldn't handle the negative impact that ministry was having on their family. And I'll admit, I would be one of the 42%, probably some silent, also non-confessional participants in this survey that had that thought cross my mind. Am I effective? Is this worth it? How long can I continue? Is this sustainable? And, there's a lot of jobs, again, in post-pandemic years that employees were feeling a higher degree of stress at home, in their family life, certainly students as well. So high stress and extra stress in those years was not unique, I think, to being employed in ministry. Even parenting, I could tell you, is definitely high stress to navigate your emerging young adult through this huge disruption in the world, and also in faith and in relationships in the family home. So it wasn't so much about the stress, but certainly I think what was the hardest to cope with was feeling the isolation, feeling alone in the fight. And as much as you dream big, as much as you seize the Christ opportunity, all of the desires and the appeals for partnering and collaboration and a conviction to join God's calling, for he appoints everyone to be his disciples, to be teachers, missionaries, evangelists, to partner in growing the gospel. It was a time that I felt more leaders were stepping back than stepping in. I do not enjoy constantly putting out fires when I want some of my energy preserved for pursuing God's dreams and vision. But that was the reality. And I had to fight this kind of knee-jerk reaction, this knee-jerk temptation, compulsion to just throw in the towel some days. Certainly, there are times when walking away from something difficult is our best approach, but it shouldn't be our first line of response. Sometimes we need to recognize there's nothing more that the situation can offer, but not before we examine if it's our mindset, our attitude, our approach, the extent of our faith that could be part of the problem. And so this idea to reboot is to see if we can reset some of those entrenched mindsets and attitudes, those prevailing ideas, to actually challenge them, whether they're coming from God or whether they're coming from an enemy that wants to undermine us, that wants to pull the rug out from underneath us, that wants to fuel any hint of doubt and discouragement. There's this concept in psychology called the growth versus the fixed mindset. And we have a slide that just kind of shows that visually in terms of, is your mind open, expanding, leaning into growth, or is it locked down? This is definitely part of the reason why people feel stuck and why churches feel stuck or even start to experience decline. A growth mindset is needed to embrace change, to learn new things, to adapt. A growth mindset also has to be a courageous mindset because you're going to take risks. You could fail. You could miss the mark. Conversely, that fixed mindset is ruled by fear, seeing that failure would actually be equivalent to defeat. It won't entertain any data that could disrupt its prevailing worldview. A big flag for this is if you notice you're getting just defensive when presented with different ideas. The important thing in response is to check and be aware. Hey, I'm feeling a little defensive. I'm feeling my hackles are up. Can I instead shift that energy to be curious as to whether this feedback might have some truth to it, might be relevant, might have a nugget that I can take away, or is it entirely off base? But when I challenged myself on that, I discovered it really was facing a fear that I have disappointed somebody or let somebody down that triggered a defensiveness. It was new data that challenged my worldview that my intentions would be enough And sometimes they aren't. Sometimes good intentions don't align with our capacity or our ability to execute. And we have to face the hard truth that we might have disappointed somebody. One of my colleagues who did quit pastoring last year explained his decision based on this desire to lead and shepherd a church in a growth mindset. He wanted nothing more than to help them explore the deep questions of life and to push them forward into growth and becoming better human beings. But he said after years of trying, he felt like the majority of people showing up at church didn't want to have a growth mindset. Rather, they wanted to learn more about what they already knew. They wanted to learn more about what they already believed. And I saw that. I saw that in my own denomination and my own experiences, is that sometimes the appeals and the questions is like, tell us more about why we believe is right versus, compare it to other teachings that are wrong. Instill in us just like a certainty. And I believe that God is calling us since the Reformation and before as a Protestant church to continually be renewed, to continually be reformed, to continually wrestle with him as Jacob did, seeking a deeper understanding, seeking to broaden our concept of who he is and who the family of God might be. This colleague's conclusion was, I just couldn't match and marry my perspective with the institutional church. And they walked away. Now, maybe God was truly releasing them to pursue another type of calling, to fulfill a different kind of ministry. But the red flags for me in the fixed mindset that might have been lurking there was this idea that all the problems were external. It was the system, it was the denomination, it was the people in the church. This is definitely putting us into fixed mindset territory when all the blame and all the problems lie outside of us and our control. But if we nurture a growth mindset, we might just encounter some new solutions, some new approaches, some new ideas with how to persist and endure and be resilient to challenging situations. Are we not partnering with a God who brought water from a rock? Then certainly he can do a new thing in our lives, in our mindsets, in our hearts, in our motives, in our agendas. Certainly this is the God that can tease out from us extra patience and long-suffering and kindness, the fruits of the Spirit. So if you hear yourself thinking and even saying, the problem with this church is XYZ, it's just not offering me da-da-da-da-da. Ask how much time and energy you first spent on contemplating if you've been part of any initiative or participation to make a shift, to make a change, to offer something different, to advocate for something new. While these terms, fixed mindset and growth mindset, are contemporary psychological concepts, first identified by Dr. Carol Dweck, there are strong biblical principles and teachings that align with this idea of how vital and how key it is to assess and check and reframe our mindset. And what I think is one of the strongest themes is that the Bible identifies the key antidote to having a fixed, entrenched, or locked mindset. That key element, that key posture, that key attitude to confront a fixed mindset is humility. There's a discipline that sometimes we don't talk about too much in church, the discipline of self-suspicion. As Christians, we should be somewhat skeptical of our inner voice, especially when we insist that we are right and have done nothing wrong. That's because we know that we're born with a corrupted nature. We're born with a default for selfishness. This is why every parent, every teacher, every aunt and uncle, every grandparent knows how much work and intention it takes to train a child to share, to help. You have to nurture that out of them. That's why the twos are so terrible, because they're suddenly gone from getting every cry catered to now discovering the world is not just about their instant gratification and demands. It takes hard work. It takes a reprogramming of our minds. So we should never be too cocky, too confident about the perfection of our character. You see, the scriptures warn us that our hearts can be murky and our motives can be compromised by the shadow of self-interest. We'll put this scripture on, it's Jeremiah 17:9, which says, the human heart, the mortal heart, is the most deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is? Thankfully, Jesus does. And he doesn't back away from it. He's willing to work with our self-deception and self-delusion. Proverbs 16:18 also is the origin of a phrase that is common in colloquial English, which is pride goes before a fall. Pride goes before destruction. The bigger the ego, the harder the fall. And I love this promise also from the wisdom of Proverbs that says, but trust in the Lord with all your heart. You can turn and surrender your heart to him and lean not on your own understanding. When we lean on our own understanding, that's the road to a fixed mindset. It's also the road to frustration when our mindset, our willpower lets us down, prevents us from grabbing hold of the abundant life that Jesus offers. So he's saying, trust your heart. Trust yourself to gain and be open to God's wisdom and his understanding. Moving from this fixed mindset to a growth mindset is not easy. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to confront your own resistance and reluctance. You have to adopt a posture of acceptance, even eagerness to face change. It starts by shifting from being presented with something new, a new idea, a new opportunity, and recognizing, is your mind going to all the reasons why not? Why not? I can't help with kids. I'm not a parent. I have no sense of humor. I don't know how to connect with them. My schedule's really busy. All the why nots. Could our church do more in terms of alleviating poverty? Well, here are all the why nots. And sometimes I get confronted when you have God's dream and God's vision with all the why nots, why it can't happen, why it's not a great idea. We need to balance that with all the reasons to try. What could be possible? What could be achieved? What is worth the risk in taking that new step? Talking to a new stranger and turning them into a friend. Opening up and shifting a conversation from the workplace into the spiritual. Instead of all the why not do it, why not try? What have we got to lose and what do we potentially have to gain? That will drive us to a growth mindset. Philippians 4:13 encourages us by saying we can do all things through Christ who gives us the strength. It's not on our own self-sufficiency. And I'm so saddened and heartbroken really about how many people I'm talking to these days who have foregone the blessing of the Sabbath, who are feeling like it's a necessity for them to take that extra shift, to work, to put more money in the bank. And I get it. These are hard times. We're feeling squeezed from all ends, but It means we need more than ever to know the rest that Jesus offers, the security that he offers, the provision that he offers. And maybe that lesson comes in learning to live off rice and beans for a while. Maybe that lesson comes in learning to be generous to people who have even less, making room and margin and capacity and examining our true priorities, our true reliance. Because harder days are coming, darker days are coming. So if we don't take the opportunity now to be flexible in growing our faith, in stretching our trust in Jesus, and testing him and knowing that he is true, how will we handle when the hammer falls heavier, when the other shoe drops? But we can do all things through Christ who will provide us the strength. That's the promise I want you to hold today. Romans 12:2 also tells us, beware not to get conformed to the ways and the patterns of this world, but offers us a claim of transformation when we renew our minds, when we let go of old ideas and we embrace the opportunities that come through faith, recognizing we serve a God whose mercies are new every morning. This is a God doing new things, making streams in the desert, making pathways where there was never before. Ellen White, in her inspired writing, says, God has 1,000 ways to provide for us which we know not of. What a revelation. What an inspiration to trust this generous God. Isaiah calls, as the prophet, calls to the people saying, don't cast your mind. Don't keep in mind the former things. Don't consider the things of the past. He's recognizing that Israel had been stuck in the where they were and had failed to focus on where God led them to. He was prescribing to them a reboot, a mental reboot, to not dwell on the previous abuses and injustices, but to acknowledge that God was bringing justice to them now. The old paradigms, the old way of doing things, the old stories were not serving them. He commands them to not get stuck in a bondage, scarcity, and defeatist mindset. He understands that it's been hard for them. This is a compassionate, tender-hearted God. He knows that this is not an easy task, which is why he's putting this vision before them in prophet after prophet. He's saying there is light on the other side of these trials, but don't let the pain of the past blind you to the possibilities of your future. Jesus, in his own words, uses a teaching that I think really resonates with this fixed and growth mindset, this idea of old and new. It's recorded in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but I'll just read it from Matthew chapter 9. He's using an illustration. He says, people do not put new wine into old wineskins, because if they do, it's going to burst. The wine will run out and everything will be ruined, the wineskin and this fruit of the vine. Instead, pour new wine into new wineskins so both will be preserved. Now, we have this notion when we think sometimes of a wineskin, of the modern day flask, and it's, small, a little pouch that people could carry with them. But in the cultural context of Jesus, when they made new wine, if you see a picture of it, it's unmistakable that what the wine is contained in is the full skin of a sheep, of a lamb. And it needs to be new skin because it has to be subtle, it has to be flexible, it has to be able to contain the fermentation and the bubbling and the chemistry that's happening inside. Where an old, brittle wineskin is inflexible. It's fixed. And Jesus is speaking so deeply, and I don't know that even his listeners understood, but he's saying he was the new wine in a new wineskin. these lambs that were brought to slaughter were themselves metaphors for sacrifice and atonement. But he's saying, I'm doing a new thing with this old metaphor. And now I'm using a new metaphor to explain the old metaphor. Jesus did a new thing. He could have been fixed as a God, fixed as a deity in the throne of heaven, but holding nothing of that as in his entitlement, which absolutely it is. He expanded himself. Can you grasp how God himself took on a growth mindset in order to understand fully what it was to be his fallen human children? To feel pain in ways that he had never experienced before, to feel the physical suffering, to feel the limitations of the skin and bones and flesh. This metaphor is radical and transformative in nature because he's saying, I've come as new wine in a new skin, and it's so that something better can be preserved. Don't try and stuff me into the old wineskin of the traditional religion. Don't try and stuff me into old notions of who God is. Be open to receiving Jesus, the new wine, in something new. And so this metaphor, I believe, calls us today to be spiritually open and flexible and willing to embrace the transformative power and love of Jesus, both internally and collectively. This is what has to shape our church culture if we hope to grow at a time where more and more people are abandoning faith of all kind. More and more people are giving up on the idea of any God. This is the time that we say, Jesus, we receive you as new wine. We're ready to do a new thing at Oakridge Adventist Church. We're ready to do a new thing in our neighborhood in the city of Vancouver. And what will that take? Where will I have to be a little bit more flexible with my time, with my budget, with my resources, with my experiences, with my talents? To do a new thing, to experiencing a new thing requires us to shift, to change, to be open, to not face tomorrow like we did yesterday, to not look ahead at this year like we did in 2023. But this is the exciting thing, is that Jesus meets us in the promise of renewal. Jesus meets us with the offer for a reboot, a reprogramming.